Anyway. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tanya Oziel and I'm the Chief Executive of the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay our respects to elders past, present and future, for they hold the hopes, traditions and culture of Indigenous Australia. I am so delighted today to welcome our very special guests, the Honourable Gabrielle Upton MP, Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier of New South Wales, and Professor Hugh Durrant-Whyte, New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer. Today, Gabrielle and Hugh will be talking about COVID as a catalyst, the innovation economy. We are delighted to be joined from a wide-ranging audience from across the Tasman, so welcome to all our Kiwi cousins. Thank you for joining us. Today's briefing is on the record and media will be present, so we would also like to welcome members of the media. Before I pass on to Hugh and Gabrielle, I would like to acknowledge CommBank, IBM, Red Hat and Service New South Wales for their amazing support of our VEvent series. We wouldn't have been able to bring you the best thought leadership across the Tasman without this support. So we really do acknowledge the wonderful investment you've made in bringing this series to the business community. I'm now going to hand over to Gabrielle and Hugh, and then we will have a moderated discussion, and then we will go on to a poll and share the results of that poll. So without further ado, over to Gabrielle and Hugh.
Well, thank you, Tanya, and I hope you can hear me. We've done our sound checks, and I wanted to acknowledge my colleague, Professor Hugh Durrant-Whyte, who's our Chief Scientist and Engineer in New South Wales. And I want to thank Tanya and Johnny for the invitation. I've known of your work for quite some time. I ran into Tanya, 2011, I think it was, when she was doing her second AFL peace team, where she brought together Palestinians and Israelis to play AFL, and we've continued that association since then. It's given me the opportunity to go back and see all the amazing forums you've had, and a colleague of mine who I've worked very closely with, Victor Dominello, who's Minister for Customer Service, I know was one of your guests not that long ago. And Hugh, I just wanted to explain, he is probably exemplar of something that we'd like to see more of in our state internationally, a person who, as a top-notch academic, works with Sydney University, also works in industry, so he spans that spectrum of innovation. And he has a world-leading credential in terms of machine learning and robotics. And it's a real joy to work with him because he's pragmatic, he works with government, he works with business, and yet he's at the top of his field academically. So a great collaborator to really bring a focus on what we are both working on together with some eminent people across Australia, which is to make sure that we have an acceleration of research and development into commercialised products, jobs and services across our state. And as a state government, we're very focused on pragmatic outcomes, and it's become even more pertinent in COVID. So when you commercialise research, whether it's discovery research, experimental research, or whether it's kind of an innovation around software for businesses, what that means for a state government, which is some of the most important things we can do, are new jobs. Again, very pertinent during COVID, given the level of unemployment, which hasn't fully been unmasked yet. New services, new products. And of course, through the kind of prism of what we're looking for in relation to COVID, a vaccine, it's brought a real spotlight onto what our scientists and researchers are doing. And again, the kind of bench to bed aspect of medicine research and commercialising product. So I thought I'd back up a little bit. We have a great audience here. I want to thank you. I can see you across the Tasman as well, which is really gratifying. It's the benefit of the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. And I can see people from academia, from business, and I thank you for joining today. Research and development, I just want to kind of define that in terms of the Frascati definition. It's the creative and systematic work undertaken to increase the stock of knowledge, to devise new applications of available knowledge. So research and development is the process of increasing our knowledge and then applying that knowledge. And I came across a phrase which to me encapsulates that really well for those of us who are not academics. And, you know, the common facts that we take for granted today are really products of yesterday's research. We don't even think about them in those terms, but it underscores the importance of research being taken into the real world in terms of jobs, products and services. So New South Wales hasn't done very well in terms of commercialising its research over time. There are some great innovative examples, you know, a couple to mind. You know, we had two researchers who effectively founded Google Maps, Wi-Fi, ubiquitous now, electronic pacemaker, I could go on. And then, of course, I've mentioned what Hugh Durrant-Whyte is doing in the area of managing what we do in mines, automated mines, and with cargo. We've got a range of strengths in research itself, and Hugh will talk a little bit to that. Quantum computing, robotics, I've mentioned, material sciences, medical technology. And we've also got the great inputs of world-class universities, with a number of them in the top 100 across the world. We've got a highly skilled workforce relative to the per capita measure of other states. And of course, but for COVID, we have a desirable location where people want to come to. But the measures tell us that the outputs from those great inputs don't match up. And so if you look at some national indexes, so the Global Innovation Index, Australia, not New South Wales, but Australia, is ranked 15 for innovation inputs, but 30 for innovation outputs. So there's something that's happening between that translation of ideas to jobs, products and services. And so with that in mind, and I had a little bit of background in a university, sitting on their board for a number of years, it was one of the most extraordinary things I had done. I went to the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, and I said, you know, research and development commercialisation is an economic lever. We have an investment in it. I don't know that we measure that return on investment. We've got now almost $100 billion invested into hard infrastructure, some of that in relation to COVID specifically. But beyond the hard infrastructure investment, we need to have a soft infrastructure strategy as well. And with that, she accepted the challenge I put to her. She said, you know, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, I want to draw an eminent group of people together to put an action plan together, something that's nimble. It doesn't have to go through a bureaucratic process of different coloured papers. And we want to do it in a way where we focus on a couple of things and focus on them well. So when we looked across what we did in government, Hugh again will speak more to this, there were pockets of excellence in terms of translation research. Two of them are under Hugh's leadership. One is our Medical Devices Fund, small amount of money originally invested in 2014 that's had lots of dividends in terms of technologies that have been commercialised, products, services, again with a focus on medical devices. Hugh more recently, at the end of last year, launched a Physical Sciences Fund as another kind of a broadening of a model that really worked very well. But Hugh will talk to that more in a moment. The group that I drew together is chaired by David Gonski, who's known to everybody. And in that group, we have David Thodey, Catherine Livingston, Gillian Broadbent, Jennifer Westacott, a couple of Vice-Chancellors, Barney Glover, Paul Wellings, venture capitalist, Daniel Petrie. So it was an idea of bringing all those big minds together with perspectives they have that are above our state. We held a public consultation last year that was gratifyingly kind of responded to very strongly by people. We're continuing to have targeted meetings, and we've chosen 4 levers to look at. So in addition to the 2 specific questions that have been asked today of you for us to focus on, the 4 things we focused on were jealously what a state can do, not what the federal government could do in terms of taxing, tax benefits, immigration, but looking at what a state itself can do. And so we looked at, you know, what can a state do? A state procures goods and services. We have a spend that's $30 billion, which is large. How can we use that better to drive innovation in our economy? How can we create a sense of where people can find things within government if they're looking for technologies, looking for either, you know, technologies that are high up the translational measure or very kind of nascent? Can we do a better job of being the kind of what to say, kind of the speed dating agency, if I could put a colloquial phrase around that. So that was one, government action. What can we do ourselves? The other thing was, how do we attract and retain talent? What is it we need to do to pitch what we do around research and development? What is our brand New South Wales? There's a brand Sydney, I think, which is more based principally around the wonderful Sydney Harbour and all the aspects of that. But we should more focus that. And we did announce at the end of last year a New South Wales global strategy that went to that, which of course is not a big focus at the moment because our borders are closed. But in that comes a recognition we need to really focus on what it is we want to push in terms of why people should want to come here and support what we're doing on an innovation front in certain areas. The third lever we looked at is collaboration. So the state has an important job of bringing people together, creating places where innovation can happen. We have planning powers, we have policy that can make that happen. And there's some really great examples of that, including the Aerotropolis, the Westmead Medical Research Centre, and of course, a very exciting technological precinct, which is down at Central Eveleigh, called the Tech and Innovation Central, which is going to have Atlassian as a foot anchor tenant. And the final one was translation. So what's the role? Where are the absences of private sector or university activity in that, from scale-ups through to commercialised product? Where should the government come in and assist, and what should that look like? So COVID's made that even more important because the state focus, as you'll hear our Treasurer and Premier say, is about jobs, jobs and jobs. There has been that $30 billion response in terms of a total package. There are specific things around research and development that were announced, $11 million fund, which will be kind of purposed and explained a little bit further quite soon. But I wanted to hand to Hugh there so that he can talk more to the specifics.
So Gabrielle and I are quite a good team, actually, because although I do the technical stuff, Gabrielle also does the essential part, which is to translate it into a language that the political decision makers actually need to make these things execute. So my role as chief scientist has a number of elements, but two that are probably the most important here are that I support universities through various funding mechanisms, trying to really build centres of excellence, trying to provide critical research infrastructure, and also trying to build what we call innovation networks. So in particular areas, how we genuinely try to bring together not just academic research, but the whole ecosystem around a particular discipline. The second thing I do is I work very closely with Treasury and industry to build the industry strategies, the precincts, and if you like, all these translation mechanisms that genuinely try and get research and development much more into how we get commercialization, how we build jobs, and so on. And there's a lot that's happened, I think, due to COVID-19. I mean, we clearly were making a big case, I'm sure people are aware, for building some significant precincts in and around New South Wales. Aerotropolis is one, the Tech Precinct is another, and Westmead is a third. And we certainly had programs underway, Medical Devices Fund, which I'll mention again in a few minutes, Physical Sciences Fund, and so on. But there's really been an acceleration, I think, in the last 2 or 3 months to say, how do we genuinely translate this and really get good prosperity and good job outcomes? And I think the strategy there, aligning again with what Gabrielle was talking about, I think has a number of elements to them. I think the first thing to say is there's very much a doubling down on the precinct concept that says if we are going to spend money, we should try and focus it in areas where we think we have comparative advantage. And those areas are really aligned very much with the precincts. So in Aerotropolis, for example, there's a big focus on aerospace, defense, and agtech. And we're very, very active in trying to attract big defense primes, big agriculture companies, areas like circular economy that are allied to that, to really set up significant tier 1 businesses within the Aerotropolis precinct. And I think it's very important that we recognize, and I'm sure this is true in New Zealand as well, that we are part of an international supply chain in this, that we need to attract the big Lockheeds and Boeings and British Aerospaces of this world so that we can genuinely build the tier 2, tier 3 companies that can actually draw on the research excellence that we have in areas like quantum computing, quantum sensing, robotics, to really build us as part of a larger ecosystem internationally. I think other areas, particularly digital economy, is very, very important, and the tech precinct speaks to that a lot. I'm not sure people are aware, but there have been 18 $1 billion companies founded in the digital area in the last 6 or 7 years in Sydney, and it's a real growth area. And whereas I think of Metropolis is very much this kind of attraction space, I think of the digital economy area as very much the scaling space. How do we take businesses that are already significant and add the R&D, whether it's in machine learning, data analytics, quantum computing technologies, these sorts of things, and really scale them into a position where they can be competitive. And again, building on not just the core digital technologies, but areas where I think Sydney's already got some really great companies, particularly in the fintech area, in the regulation technology area, all those sorts of digital applications, and indeed in terms of digital applications for things like the resources industry and agriculture and so on. So there's that component to it. And then there's what I think of as the kind of medical devices area, which again, been briefly mentioned a few times. The Medical Devices Fund has been running now for about 6 or 7 years. The government's put about 50 million odd investment into a series of different companies. But that fund has managed those companies to, if you like, get over the valley or the trench of death to a point where they've managed to attract about 600 or 700 million in private venture funding. And a number of companies have really grown to significant scale. And that just shows you this translation piece, how we try and get companies or potential companies out of universities into a place where they can translate their technology and ultimately scale into trying to build a newer industry. So for us, Westmead is going to be the place where we genuinely try and build medical technologies, not just in the medical devices area, but also in pharmaceutical. So the double down on that is really trying to, I guess, not just locate what we're going to do, so what are the industries, but also how we're going to do it. So I think this is something that we genuinely go to our RDEC committee for. So, I don't think governments are ever that good at picking winners, but what we should be good at is trying to invest in the ecosystem, trying to invest in those sorts of support facilities, key pieces of buildings and technology and transport mechanisms that genuinely actually build an ecosystem and attract those companies, allow them to scale, allow them to translate. And so there's a how part of it as well that's very, very important to the way we're trying to operate. I will say, because we mentioned it just at the beginning of this, one thing that does genuinely, I think, worry us at this point is what the future of universities is going to be in this mix. Clearly, as an academic, and someone who's translated a lot of companies out of academia, I'm absolutely confident that the future of this state and the future of not just Australia, but all our countries is dependent on the knowledge that comes out of the universities. And yet we are in a position at this point where the funding that's going into universities, I'm not sure people are aware of this, but in the recent ABS funding round, analysis of research funding, at universities, about 60% of funding actually comes from universities themselves, and only 16% of funding for research actually comes from the federal government. So with a loss of overseas students, a lot of that funding into R&D will disappear. And we've got to be very concerned, I think, about how we continue to ensure that our universities have the support they need in order to be able to deliver the kinds of great outcomes which we come to rely on them for really driving this sort of knowledge and prosperity and R&D translation in the future. So as I said at the beginning, Gabrielle and I are the duo that kind of are trying to make this happen, and we have very complementary strengths. And I will say there's a lot of appetite, I think, in New South Wales now for really trying to address some of these issues and take them forward. And I think a lot of opportunities, never miss a good crisis, in the COVID epidemic to genuinely try and make that translation happen and really make it stick as part of our culture going forwards. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, guys. My name is Max McLaren. I'm the GM of Red Hat, and I've got the privilege of asking some questions that are coming in from the various attendees on this call to our two guests today. So a couple of questions so far. In the healthcare industry especially, the state government is a major procurer of services. So how can we drive procurement innovation to support the smaller businesses to participate more easily in perhaps co-designing innovative new services, applications, and tools to manage and support COVID and post-COVID?
So I might speak to that first, if that's all right with you, Gabrielle.
Yeah, go.
So actually, Medical Devices Fund was very much set up to do that. It was early on recognised that Medical Devices Fund, let me go down one step of detail. It's basically a fund that people can apply to if they are able to, or they want to show a product that's in an R&D or a translational R&D area that they genuinely believe will have an impact on the healthcare industry in New South Wales. So part and parcel of funding this company is the fact that it actually will provide services to New South Wales Health as you go along. So it was very much the original driver for it. And the fund that we provide is not take an equity share. It's essentially it's a repayable loan. In fact, you don't have to repay it unless you become successful. So it's, in some sense, until you actually go public, the money's free, okay? And it's genuinely worked in lots of different ways to help that whole procurement supply chain. So, you're funding things, for example, like implantable devices for pain relief, or Elastogen, which is a well-known company that went public last year, which is this synthetic skin. There was a real requirement in New South Wales Health. And so it funds those, the companies develop that, they sell it to New South Wales Health, and they use that as their market driver to really come up the stack. Having said all that, to just preempt some other questions, whereas health has actually been quite innovative, I think, in the way that's happened, the rest of government has not been. So one of the big drivers in our deck has been to say, can we change our procurement processes so that we make it easier for smaller companies with more innovative ideas to come to the party to suggest, for example, digital solutions to problems or other sorts of areas. I suspect we won't get a startup company to build a road, but there are lots of other things that we could. And can we actually change the way that we do procurement to make that happen? And I agree with you, that's one big lever that New South Wales government has. And the Physical Sciences Fund is kind of tackle some of the other elements of that. And I will say both funds, Physical Sciences Funds and Medical Devices Funds, have got a lot of publicity inside government as potential mechanisms for really changing things. Would you agree with that, Gabrielle?
I do. So some of the members of our committee who are entrepreneurs themselves, we call it the RDAC. So it's the Accelerating Research and Development Advisory Committee, which Dave Gonski's chair. And one of the entrepreneurs there who's gone on to be a venture capitalist said, the most important thing that anybody did for me when I was a scale up was to give me a government contract, to positively choose my company for an innovative feature. And in fact, take a little bit of risk on that. So I think government's approach to things, but COVID maybe changed that mindset, it's not maybe let's procure a good or a service for good long-term value. It might be more a short-term, secure, blue chip decision around who you procure goods and services for. So I do think we have an opportunity coming to the kind of the title of this whole discussion to say that thinking, that ability to take a little bit more risk on the side of government that's more risk averse, more thinking about short-term value de-risking, is an opportunity to say a little bit of risk on the part of government that's calibrated amongst the procurement business that they do can make a difference to building jobs and services and products and actually provide better customer, stakeholder, citizen value in the long term.
There's a sort of a follow-on question, and I think you kind of answered it, but perhaps we can explore how to do that in a little bit more detail, is a sort of a national pilot testing scheme to which small businesses can submit Aussie innovation and then be put on some sort of panel that governments can look at. Is that what the RDEC system is designed to do?
No, not really. I mean, the RDEC is really trying to grapple with what I think of more as ecosystem problems. So what are the levers that we have? Procurement is one, precinct perhaps is another, investing in some critical infrastructure, say advanced manufacturing and so on is a third, those sorts of things. How do we make that possible? We do have another mechanism that we are working on, which I chair in fact, called the Waratah Research Network, which is a network of all the departments in government, which now has a presence on the web, and all their R&D and innovation projects, in a sense of trying to expose what we're doing internally to potential companies who might be able to provide a service in a much easier way than it is done now. You see what I mean? I think, you know, let's be clear here, there are limited levers that the state government has in these sense, in terms of panels and these sorts of things. But what we can do is create, if you like, that general infrastructure. And that's what the RDAC is really aiming to do. Gabrielle?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges is how does one publicize one's ability to provide these capabilities? And I'm sure innovation's happening all the time in the normal ebb and flow of delivering services to government and to commerce and industry in the rest of Australia. So I guess one of the options that we could explore is how do we get some more publicity for those innovative ideas and you know, step on the shoulders of each other in terms of growing and developing those capabilities.
Absolutely, yes.
So one of the ideas that, again, we call it's the acronym. It's always good to have an acronym because it makes it simpler for all of us. But the RDAC, again, who are an advisory committee, thought was important is that we could do a better job, to your point, Max, about creating kind of wayfinding within government, and perhaps in a way that other organisations in the community can't do. We could actually be a place, I mentioned kind of the speed dating thing, where we could actually make innovation a little bit more visible. Because I'm really interested, I noticed from the RSVP list today, we've got corporates, large and small, represented in them. And when I have conversations, as does Hugh, with kind of primes and substantial companies that have shareholders, I say, you know, so what do you do about research and development? And sometimes there can be a pause in the conversation. They don't really think about what they do as being a research and development translation activity. But when you drill a little bit more, you find that actually that is going on all the time, and different companies do it in different ways. Some take equity stakes in a fund where new technologies can be flushed through and they're not taking big risks by having a look-see with a small amount of capital they invest. But coming back to the point, is there a role that government could play that would suit some of your participants here, where they might be able to see inside a kind of a funnel, the different innovations that might be going on collaboratively, maybe with other businesses, maybe at the very kind of nascent end of the innovation ecosystem, which is when, you know, ideas are just being thrown up through startups, through universities, and maybe become a place where we can not credential them, but actually just make them more visible. So just be interested amongst your attendees here about how they do an innovation, and whether something like that, where we kind of aggregate and make more visible what's going on, might be helpful for them taking up new ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating area. You know, in our business, one deals with a variety of different endpoints in terms of providing services, and trying to figure out how to publicize those great things are kind of down to the organization. I'm sure there's an ability to broadcast that more. And one of the questions here, you know, explores how we can perhaps buy services in hospitals, etc., and explore new ways to get services into hospitals, as opposed to the traditional way of just getting, you know, goods and services into organizations like pharmaceutical innovation and virtual care apps and in-home services, etc., because that's quite challenging to try and get that into hospitals. So I think that goes along the same point. You know, how do we better publicize these things? Changing slightly the angle, how does the strategy fit with the rest of, I suppose, government in Australia in terms of the COVID-19 economic stimulus package? Do you see dovetails in that regard?
This work is critical to creating jobs, and Hugh and I have done, I think, a really gratifying task of explaining to New South Wales Treasury how research and development and universities fit into creating jobs, smart jobs, because an economy like New South Wales should be able to with our population base and the reasons I articulated before with all those great inputs, we should be building jobs for the future of future industries. And so, you know, construction jobs are really, really important, and that's where a big focus of the state has been in keeping our construction sector going through the big infrastructure investment we have and extending construction hours, etc. But we also need to think beyond that. So where does it fit in the COVID response? It's absolutely squarely at the middle of it, because out of COVID, you want to build sustainable jobs for the future. There was also an announcement, some of you may have seen last week, by a Minister for Industry and a Minister for Tertiary Education with the birthing of a TAFE facility around manufacturing skill in the West, and that's to complement the Aerotropolis, which is obviously based around a new airport. It's a new city. It has so many, it's like designing a city from scratch, and Hugh is assisting WACA, which is the authority there that takes into account both local government, state government and federal government investment into that new city. But yes, there are the skills, the trades that we need to support this economy, but we also need the smart jobs. So I think it sits really well alongside, and I think New South Wales, for all the reasons I mentioned, is probably better set up to be able to have that smart economy, those smart jobs that are actually going to be sustainable.
And
sorry. So I might add to that a little bit, is you know, we definitely dovetail. So I mean, you know, it's one of the, for example, one of the reasons that Aerotropolis is looking heavily on in the defence side is the large investment that the feds are making in defence equipment at the moment. And again, the advanced manufacturing piece, that's a big push by the federal government. Aerotropolis is our node for that. And there are co-investments that we're producing in terms of fabrication and so on. And so we tend to, you know, we try and leverage significantly on what the federal government is doing, but also I have to say we also try and use our own levers. So as we were talking about things like procurement, to genuinely attract companies here, as well as just building from scratch, particularly foreign direct investment in those sectors.
Yeah, I would imagine we're continually in a competitive race with not just other states, but other nations to try and attract these areas. And having lived in Singapore through their transformation into what they called a smart state, where they attracted a huge amount of pharmaceutical investment in the early 2000s, I saw that in reality. Is there something that you think that we can perhaps drive further, as opposed to these three areas of initiative to compete with foreign nations in this perhaps slowly crumbling globalization of the world?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure Gabrielle will have views, but I do a lot of work on investment attraction for the precinct. And the number one thing every company says is skills, number one. So it's not real estate, it's skills. And so again, I have to be honest, working with the universities and indeed TAFE is kind of crucial to that, to make sure that we've got people who are, for example, trained in quantum sensing or quantum computing or robotics or all of these high-tech skills, because although they may be in small number, they're ultimately the seed that does the attraction for all the other pieces that follow behind that. And so that's important. But I will say also, it's you know, we've got some niches, and I pick, again, things like medical devices and so on, which are genuinely good here. And we, you know, should try and not find those, but at least create the ecosystem in which those can thrive. Okay. And I'll come back to something else Gabrielle said. Sometimes the government does play a role in that, because it's better, truthfully, to give a company a contract than it is to subsidize them, you know. And so we need to find the kind of mechanism to make sure that that sort of happens. And again, you know, a lot of these jigsaw kind of pieces come together. Precincts have a role in that. You know, the fact that you can create a new city that's focused on defense, aerospace, and ag tech is a big deal, you know, and the sort of thing, frankly, that even Singapore would struggle to create a new city, right? And with an airport and everything else. So let's use that. Let's try and exploit those advantages in a way that we can.
Yes, and I think your view of skills and the STEM subjects in particular is something else someone's asked about, and the fact that apparently in the example they quote is in their daughter's school, IT was removed from the curriculum in the recent times, which is concerning, given the fact that being in this industry, I know that one of the biggest challenges is getting skilled people, and I'm sure you guys find the same thing. And how we transform our education system to be more STEM based, and therefore drive more skills, to your point, Hugh, to attract those foreign investors, I think is a perennial challenge that we all have, and would be interesting to see what you guys think about that.
So I think you know, there is movement at the station. Okay, you know, with another hat on, my Sydney University role, you know, I am helping to drive a lot of digital initiatives at the moment, and I look at the numbers in the you know, computer science area, and for every year for the last 5 years, we've had a 25% increase in the number of students. So this is just phenomenal growth, right? And a lot of the reason is not just because we are, you know, you know, this neck of the woods. We're not just creating computer science people, but now it's about open data. Now it's about trust and verification. Now it's about privacy. And there are whole ranges of other fields that impinge upon that, and the way that we need to bring digital technologies to the front of where we're going in health, in agriculture, in society in general. And so people are getting a very different view. It's no longer the silo that we used to know when we developed Unix code, right? It's now much broader than that, with broader skills. And we do need to change. And I think some universities at least are beginning to not just recognize that, but develop the right graduates. How far that propagates down to schools is tricky. You know, again, I often feel that the way we need to present this to people, but to, you know, schools, and the way that they need to teach, is as problems to be solved, not subjects to be mastered, if that makes sense. So how do I genuinely build a COVID-19 app? How do I genuinely, you know, address a medical devices problem? Or how do I genuinely do this? And that's a very different mindset, because not only do we need skills, but we need people who can actually make a difference, solve problems, do stuff.
Ergo hopefully comes from STEM.
Yep.
Something that we need to, you know, revisit all the time. And I know in our industry we do a lot of education of customers and students, and
Yep.
It's something that we continually strive to make more available in the community, is the ability just to teach people more about that, no matter what their background.
Max, can I? I'm having a look at some of the questions coming through. There's one that strikes at the heart, I suppose, of what I'm interested in. And somebody's asked, what do you need now for the business community? And that's a really great question. You know, it's kind of like, we don't know what we don't know. So how is it that, you know, I come back to one of the thoughts I put up before. We know that businesses innovate. We know that some of them do R&D. We know that some of them do aspirational R&D that has big risks attached with it. Others do non-R&D based innovation. They are all part of an innovation ecosystem and activity. So this is what I'd love to know, and I'm happy to take, you know, comments and input electronically on this. You know, is it a matter of us playing a role, as I said before, where we make what is going on in that broad innovation ecosystem more visible to people? Are there particular products and services within government that support scale-ups, that, you know, so kind of that risk capital? We have products that are in that kind of support spectrum. We do tech vouchers, which are $15,000 to people who will pair with researchers and universities to kind of test out an idea. We've got other programs in our kind of toolbox that provide supports. Now, what we don't know is whether they're the right ones, whether we're hitting the right part of that kind of support system that needs to be there to drag products through so they become jobs and products and services. So really that's a question I don't have the answer to, other than to say, you know, for mature businesses, for businesses that are SMEs, and for the scale-ups, you know, we are open as a government to understanding what it is you might need to enable you to kind of accelerate your innovation.
Thank you. I think perhaps we can get some sort of poll around that in due course, and you know, fuel those answers. Is there anything that you've seen, Hugh, over the last 3 months during the crisis that is particularly rising to the top in terms of innovation and creativity that we're not aware of and that we can perhaps leverage going forward?
Yes, look, there are a few things I think that are worth saying. One of them is this, it was growing already, but there's been a significant shift in this idea that some capabilities really do need to be sovereign, okay? That is, we need to be able to do them ourselves. So we're not about to go off and manufacture everything, but there is a big mindset shift change in perhaps the things we need to manufacture onshore, particularly in areas like pharmaceuticals and medical equipment. Clearly, you know, it's been a lot of commentary about that, but I think that's true in a number of other areas as well. Food processing, chemicals, but also components and these sorts of things. So there's definitely a view that we need to have more things that are provided onshore than we have had in the past. Fortunately, technology makes that relatively simple. I mean, you know, gone are the days where everything was about scale. These days you can print things on demand from a common design. Chemistry systems are very different. There's remote operations and a lot of other pieces that can come together to make these sorts of things a reality. So I think the sovereign piece is important, and that's been a significant shift. And I think you'll see a lot in the next 6 months to a year. You'll see a lot of investment as a consequence in advanced manufacturing in general. And by that, I don't mean just, you know, building widgets. I mean everything from food to construction as a kind of process. And I think that impacts on things like supply chains and a lot of other pieces. Perhaps the second thing that I think would you be interested in
around that? I mean, are we specifically trying to design the market, or are we letting, you know, just commerce come up with those ideas to suffice?
We are doing, to a degree, what I said earlier. We're trying to build the right ecosystem for that. So recognizing that, you know, and we have the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Center as an example. Manufacturing is not just about building widgets, it's about design and supply chains and the whole piece that needs to come together to genuinely get a product to market. But at the same time, it's also about ensuring you've got the right infrastructure. So we're definitely in the game of making sure we have advanced manufacturing capacity and capability to train some of our companies in being able to do this well and to be doing it effectively. And also to use things where we genuinely do have a comparative advantage. So, you know, in the renewable energy zones, why aren't we manufacturing energy-intensive chemicals, given that energy is effectively, you know, going to come from photovoltaics, as an example? And I think a second drive, which you'd probably be interested in, is this idea that we ought to be much better at pushing open data. So, you know, medical health, but other government records, these sorts of things that genuinely enable digital companies, onshore sovereign digital capabilities to be developed and become profitable through literally being better about the way that we share information and we use it for all the different applications we have. I think there are obvious advantages in trying to drive that home again in precincts, as an example. Aerotropolis is a new city. Let's build an open data city from day one. You know, these sorts of things.
Very exciting.
Yeah. I think also with the potential Trans-Tasman bubble, and I know that we have some people. Thank you for joining us from New Zealand. Now, what I'm interested also in your ideas of what are the opportunities that come of that we might find ourselves in a situation where we can be self-sufficient within that broader scope. And I'm not an expert in understanding exactly what New Zealand does in respect of the issue we're talking about, but what are the cross-collaborative opportunities that come from what we're thinking might be kind of an economic bubble that will be even more important than it ever has been before?
Yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to leverage each other's ideas. Great. The drop in foreign students is obviously something that's very concerning for us, and Hugh, I know you've touched on that. Do we see that as a long-term challenge? Do we actually think these scared stories are going to eventuate, or do you think that we'll get over it in the medium term once we get the virus hopefully under control?
Well, the problem is really the business model into which the universities have been forced, right? Which basically says research loses money. You know, every dollar I put in as someone who funds research, the universities have to find another $1.60 to actually be able to pay for payroll tax, the building, everything else that they go into. Home students are basically break even, more or less. And again, there's been lots of changes in the last few days. So I think we've yet to figure out what impact that's going to have. And overseas students make money. So if you were a business, you would stop doing research, right? But you don't, because actually the reputation you get from research is what drives the other two.
Yes.
So my worry is that the near-term effects, because there is no short-term subsidies really for what's going on at universities, they've genuinely actually been excluded from the process, means that a lot of the researchers who are often on temporary contracts will be eliminated. And in this state, we have about 77,000 researchers, of which 70,000 are at universities. And it's a leveraging effect too, let's be clear. So if you lose 10% of your margin for from overseas students, you will lose 20, 30, 40, 50% of your research efforts because of the way these things get leveraged, all right? Because it's a margin. So I really worry about what the future is going to be. You know, clearly, I think the universities are going to have to change their business model. And don't get me wrong, I think universities are probably they need to review the way they worked anyway. You know, there's been talk of that around. But it's going to be a very tough time in the next 6 months to a year. Very, very tough time before we see any light at the end of the tunnel. So 4 or 5, 6 years from now, yes, I think overseas students will come back. And I think Australia and New Zealand are very positive places because we have managed the whole COVID thing so well, okay? And we will be great places for people to come. But will we survive that far? Big question.
Yes.
And we've seen some very interesting kind of competitive plays by countries around the world where they are offering international students incentives to do the work online in the meantime and perhaps get a bonus in terms of a work credentialing or work permission, a visa that's kind of made more generous after the students finish. So there is a competitive market for the international talent that we want to bring here that's been potentially impacted by other countries being very proactive in kind of locking them up ahead of time. So there is a really serious issue there. And we know that for New South Wales, international education and the tourism that relates to that is one of our biggest exports. So it probably impacts us more than any other state across Australia. We don't own the kind of the, how can I put it, all the levers around universities, the economics around it. We have acts which set up their governance. So we kind of decide collaboratively how many people sit on their boards. We do give them some support. I mean, Hugh did an exercise where we looked at what is the New South Wales government investment into research inside universities, and I'll let him speak to that at the moment. So we provide things that kind of the maybe not the margin, because I think governance and the size of boards, which I was involved in reforming when I first came into Parliament, is really, really important because the boards have become more strategic and focused and targeted. But you know, we don't own the university model per se. So we've tried to help international students on kind of a humanitarian basis, which is totally appropriate. Help with kind of discounted loans on their commercial loans, which is again important, but not a major kind of impact on the difficulty they find themselves in. And of course, discussing, in fact, both Hugh and I are meeting with Vice Chancellors in universities in New South Wales tomorrow. So it will be an interesting discussion, Hugh. So maybe to you on more of that, but we don't own the business model. We have kind of important, but not central leaders to assist them.
Sure, I appreciate it's a national issue, but as to your point, it's very relevant for New South Wales given the size of the population that we have here, and I'm sure we can find some way of competing with some of those other countries that make it attractive for people to stay afterwards as a nation, because that seems to be the attractions of studying in Australia. Probably the last question, because we're almost ready to hand over to the poll, but are you seeing any correlation with the increasing awareness and understanding and the importance of sustainability and how innovation and business are creating that community and environmental focus as well in this innovation space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are in the last 8 days, just looking at my friend over there, right, of writing the state's decarbonisation strategy. And the focus for that is a lot on the companies that can be built on the back of it and what opportunities there are in the whole area. So in not just energy, but things like infrastructure, transport, agriculture, all of these sorts of areas. And there is a vast opportunity to really exploit our, frankly, natural heritage that we have in both our countries to genuinely build a much more sustainable set of businesses. So I mentioned very briefly earlier, but we have what so-called special activation precincts in the regions that are building very large energy systems, but are capable from that of really renewable energy systems are really capable of driving whole new industries on the back of that. And also rethinking the way that, for example, government procures, talking about procurement, buildings. I mean, sustainable building materials, the use of timber, for example, for building high rises and things like that, is a logical kind of way to go. So we can genuinely drive a lot of what's going on. And I think we're not the only people doing this now. I mean, don't get me wrong, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, there are about 10 other people who sort of say, well, we should be doing that too. I think there's a real momentum around the opportunities in that area. And I think the state government has a big role to play in, again, providing the right ecosystem to make it happen.
Thank you. All right, Johnny, why don't I hand over to you?
Very much, Max, and thank you so much for facilitating this session. We were talking about polls and what does business feel. This is our poll that we undertake at every one of our briefings, and we have done so over the last 3 months. We invite you to share your perspectives of how you feel as a business person now, particularly interesting for Hugh and Gabrielle and the innovative choice. Particularly for Gabrielle, is the government doing a good job? And this is all governments, federal, state, and New Zealand governments as well. So a wide-ranging question. Your own estimate of how long do you believe this will be over, if there will be over? We talked about the Trans-Tasman bubble. To what extent do you feel that will be beneficial for your business? And did the event objective today meet your objectives? We'll have the results of those in a moment. And I just want to thank both Gabrielle and Hugh. Gabrielle, thank you for taking the initiative to bring not only an eminent group, an esteemed group of personalities that you highlighted earlier to really look at the challenge facing New South Wales and the opportunity. So all credit to you for getting that group together, and certainly the massive information and ideas that came from it, and to mobilise you with your deep experience across academia, business, commercialisation. These are all the elements, all the levers that we have to pull to get our industry, our academia, and our markets together. So it's a great tag team, and we wish you good luck on the rest of your roadshow. You've invited business to come and show support. We invite our viewers to submit your ideas and your questions to us. We can convey those to Gabrielle and to Hugh, and we very much encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. Well, how do you feel as a business person? Probably on the survey, Gabrielle, you'll find it interesting. We've had it challenged at probably the highest level we have seen in many weeks. Generally, it's up at innovative, and that's been consistently the case since the beginning. So we're starting to see a little bit more, less of the dramatic innovation, more the challenging, which we touched on earlier. Generally good response from the governments, but again, tailing down a little bit from our 80s and 90% that we had over 3 months. Business planning, we're all into 12 months, and this has been consistent as well throughout our series. And the Trans-Tasman bubble will be excellent on average for most people. So we're looking forward to that as well. We want to thank Max, particularly you, for moderating today, and for Red Hat for your wonderful support of our series, and also to CBA, IBM, and ServiceNow. As Tanya mentioned, we couldn't do these briefings without you. We want this engagement. We want this outreach for our business leaders to engage, to share, and to help get through this challenge together. Please submit your ideas, your proposals, and your volunteering, your resources, your commercial input, and your ideas so that Gabrielle and Hugh can continue their incredible work. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.